Welcome everyone. We've got a fantastic turnout, 160 people in the participants. So thank you all for coming to this presentation, Reconnecting with the Past Through Digital Objects, an exploration of the Miles Lewis Building Heritage Collection. My name is Rory Hyde. I'm Associate Professor in Architecture, Curatorial Design and Practice at the University of Melbourne, and I'm going to be chairing today. Big thank you to Open House Melbourne for hosting us. This has been a largely digital festival this year with lockdowns, but there's still loads to see on the website. And also a note that we will be recording this session, and so we can add that to all of the great stuff that has come out of Open House this year. Also, big thank you to ACAHUCH, great acronym for the Australian Centre for Architectural History, Urban and Cultural Heritage, which is based at the University of Melbourne. And we have thanks to Theo in the background, who's making everything work with the Zoom and with the meeting. Yes. If you could, we have muted you all, but you're welcome to leave your cameras on, because it is lovely to see your faces and it gives us a sense of a bit of an audience out there. So thank you for those who have done that. We are going to have 4 short presentations of about 5 minutes each, where we're going to look at the project from different angles. The project being the digital collection of architectural heritage that Miles Lewis has collected. And then at the end, we will take some questions. So please, you're welcome to add those to the chat if you prefer, or we can also open up to for people to, we will release the lock on your microphones and you can speak viva voce if you prefer at the end of the session. I'm going to do a very brief introduction as well. So if I can share my screen. Can everyone see that? Okay. So the American architect Louis Kahn famously used to talk to bricks. He would ask them, "What do you want, brick?" And remarkably, the bricks answered, saying, "I like to be in an arch." Kahn listened. He stacked up his bricks into the most incredible arches, spanning entire buildings. He rarely made a brick go over a window as a lintel because, as he would say, it's against the brick's nature. Now, that's all fine when we're talking about a real brick, the heavy sort. But the team here have made something else, a digital brick. A high-resolution scan that looks like the real thing, but is made of point clouds, of code, exists in a different plane of reality from the one of Kahn's bricks. So one of the questions we're asking today is, what does a digital brick want to be? What is its nature? What does it mean when we digitize collections? In my previous life as a curator at the V&A, we would often ask, what is the object when we're dealing with digital things? Is it the code? Is it the printout? Is it the software that you made it with? Things start to get strange very quickly and the old systems start to collapse. This happened with libraries about 15 years ago. Suddenly everything's available on the internet and they have this existential crisis. Who's going to come and read our books? What is our purpose? And of course, they ended up reinventing themselves, not as places just for books, but as places of knowledge in the broadest sense, of places to make sense of things, not just for information. And museums and collections are having a similar crisis moment right now, when they realize that even objects can be digitized and the physical object no longer holds this fundamental place at the center of the museum. So what is a museum for? What's its job when things become digital? Is it about scarcity, the unique collection at the center? Or is it about abundance, about how things can be shared more widely and repurposed and reused and misused in different contexts? And finally, for our discussion, what does it mean for architects? How might we change the way that we think, the way that we look at things, the things that we look at, and the things that inspire us? How can it open up our practices to this kind of material knowledge that's being made available in new ways, excuse me. So to help us answer these questions, we have a brilliant, a brilliant panel of speakers, many of whom have explored this territory thoroughly through the digitisation of the Miles Lewis collection of architectural objects. We have Naomi Mullenby, who's the initiator of the project and librarian at the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, University of Melbourne. We have Bahl, who's the metadata and digital curator from Restore Conservation Services and a key part of the team. We had Ben Waters from SI Projects, who has led on the 3D scanning. Hannah Lewi, who's co-director of ACAHUCH and Professor of Architecture at the University of Melbourne. And as a respondent, we have Seb Chan, who's the Chief Experience Officer from ACME and really the foremost expert in Melbourne on digital collections and curating. So welcome to all of our brilliant speakers and welcome to you. Thank you for coming. I am going to hand over the reins now, first of all, to Naomi to introduce us to the project. Please welcome Naomi Mullenby.
Perfect. Thank you, Rory. So I'll get Mayhew to start my slideshow because I'm having technical difficulties today. So I'm Naomi. I'm from the Architecture, Building and Planning Library at the University of Melbourne. And I'm speaking on behalf of my fantastic collaborators, conspirators and colleagues within the library and the university who've given their expertise to this project. I'll say that there's so many people that have actually been involved in this project. It's been one of the joys of the project is having everyone contribute. So my role today is to really introduce the project, to talk a little bit about the ambitions we have for it, and then to hand over to Mayhem and Ben to talk about the details of the project. But before I begin, I feel I should start to tell you this is kind of like showing a building before it's actually complete. The finish line is in sight, but we're not quite where we wanted to be when we pitched this to open house. Originally, we'd hoped to have scanned all 300 plus objects in the collection and have the website and support materials online. But as you can imagine, doing the project over the last year, there have been a few things that have slowed us down. So that although the project is not quite where we'd hoped it would be, I really want to show it today to show you what we've achieved and to begin the conversation about what next. So on this first slide, it's a photo collage of the collection in our home, which is a series of 6 cabinets on the 3rd floor in the northwest corner of the MSD building. Within the cabinet are over 300, mostly very ordinary looking objects. To tell you their story, I need to begin by telling you that they were collected by Professor Miles Lewis over his professional career, which started in the 1970s. And Mayhew will talk more about the provenance of the collection. But looking at the objects in the cabinets, the big idea that drove the thinking around this project was, how do you provide the best access to a collection and how do you keep it in a state that responds to changes in technology? As a librarian, I have a really long-term view of collections and I'm always thinking about access and preservation. So from here we go to some photos that I snapped on my phone back in early 2019. And it's the moment when I realised that something needed to be done to make this collection more accessible. So here you can see Miles Lewis. He's teaching a class of postgrad students, showing them the objects. You might notice how many students there are and the conditions under which Miles is showcasing the objects. What comes to my mind about this moment is that the students who got to pick up the objects and physically engage with them were able to think more deeply about them and it would spark off a discussion. So this was the moment when I realised that whatever we need to do to transform the collection into a digital one, it was really important that it would be in a format that would allow the user to engage and play with the object. I think it's really key to being able to understand and question it. And I also remember wondering if there was a way to replicate having access to Miles and his knowledge. So on this next slide, you can see the objects on the trolleys and just notice the tiny little tags that are attached to some of them. This was our start in the project of knowing what each object was. On this next slide, I'm showing you a version of a spreadsheet that we worked with, which Mayhem will probably talk more about. But what I'm really showing you is that metadata is fundamental for providing access. And in this case, we were incredibly fortunate that Miles provided us with an initial spreadsheet and that he's willing to work with us and to answer all of our questions to fill in the gaps of knowledge. We're currently thinking about how to best present the backstory of the objects on the website, and there are a range of resources in development. I'd like to thank the Vera Moore Foundation for their support in this part of the project. The website will be key to allowing researchers to delve deeper into the collection and its backstory. So on the next slide, we see SI projects undertaking their 3D scans. And as a collection manager with no knowledge of 3D scanning, this element of the project was a real challenge. I had to get a handle on the language before I could start to think about how to scope it out. As the project progressed, SI projects were committed to seeking solutions to the technical challenges thrown up by the size, scale and materiality of the objects, which Ben will talk about. So whilst we have the first 50 objects scanned, scanning the remainder was the long-term goal. In the next slide, what I'm going to show you is a video of Shingle, and it's shown in the presentation platform that we chose to showcase this collection. It's called Pedestal. And Pedestal has some really great features that allows you to investigate the object quite closely. Pedestal provides you with tools to visually interrogate the objects and some metadata so you can start to question its history. And this is one of the key parts of the project, is how to place the materials or the collection online in a way that you can engage with it. So this brings me back to my first question, was how do you keep a collection, a digital collection, in a state that can respond to changes in technology? Well, for this project, we built an additional layer where we specified that all original files that were created during the process of 3D scanning and the full metadata records will be uploaded onto the university repository. The repository has a longer life expectancy than Pedestal, and in this raw state, the files are being kept independent of any platform. We hope that this is a much more robust approach that will allow future collection managers more freedom to adapt the collection. For us, this is a new digital preservation strategy, so it's going to be a case of watch, wait and see. Again, I'd like to thank all those who have been involved in the project, and whatever the future brings, we hope that we've created ways for you to access the collection now and into the future. So I'll hand over to Mayher.
Thanks, Naomi. Mayher, have we got you there?
Yeah, I was just trying to unmute myself. Sorry.
Welcome, go for it.
Thank you. I'm Mayher Bahl. Hi. And I'm the founder of Restore Conservation Services and an architecture grad at RBA Architects. I'm the person responsible for making the collection and its story accessible to a wider audience. This project consists of building materials that are unique in charting the history of building culture in Australia and situating it within the global context. The objects in the Heritage Building Materials collection were selected by Professor Miles Lewis. Here are some snapshots of him throughout his career. And he collected these objects during his professional career. It started around the 1970s, collecting the objects, not his career at all. But and he's a retired professor of architecture at the Melbourne University, and is one of the most notable architecture historians that we've got. These objects were collected over the span of his career, like I said, and were sampled from sites or objects that were given to him by students or his colleagues. I didn't know Miles in his youth, but the picture on the left exactly represents what I thought he'd be like. The collection consists of over 300 objects ranging from small nails to large iron roofing sheets, categorized under 5 broad headings: bricks, cement and plaster, ironmongery, decorative finishes, and roofing. It was to enhance the accessibility of the collection. It was important that I knew the collection inside and out for me to go ahead and start recording the metadata or even get started on this project. Unlike most cultural collections, the original curator of this collection was around to answer a lot of the questions. Professor Lewis helped a lot in that and was extremely helpful in filling in the blanks, which were a lot. But it took discussions with Miles over multiple cups of coffee to wrap my head around each and every object. It is then that I realized that the stories behind the objects were as important as the objects themselves. As this was the first 3D scanning project at this scale at the University of Melbourne dealing with an architectural collection, there were not enough established standards. The target audience was varied, and so was the intent of the collection post-digitization. It was important to capture the unusual fields such as name, size, manufacturer, and the like, but it was also important to capture what made each object unique by capturing the materiality, the inscriptions on it, its conditions, and more. A workflow was devised to track the progress of digitization and was incorporated within the metadata spreadsheet. What you can see on this image here is the general fields, which are on the inside, which are inscribed on the inside of the circle, and then the fields that we added, which are there marked in the darker black. Having gone with a generalized field would not have made us tell the story of these objects hadn't the other fields not been captured. The object shown in the center of the diagram is often pointed out as a corrugated roofing sheet by most people, but in reality, it's actually used for flooring. This is the Traeger Wellplay corrugated sheet, which has deeper corrugations than other sheets. It was used as a fireproofing medium and can be seen in the State Library of Victoria, Princess Theatre, and the Melbourne GPO. This is just one of the 300 objects that has a story to tell. These are screenshots of the videos that we've created, different snapshots that show exactly what each of these videos contain. The need to increase the accessibility of the collection only grew as the project processed. Several videos were recorded with Professor Lewis explaining aspects of the collection, object by object. To make the videos more engaging, 3D animations of the objects, explanatory diagrams, trade pamphlets, and images of the objects at original sites were added, transforming the videos into comprehensive resources. The result of this for the end user is what is exactly like watching a mini course in Australian building technologies and cultures. By this stage, the base work was set, but a platform was needed to showcase the collection. A website was the obvious answer. Restore was then engaged to carry out its creation with generous support from the Veramove Foundation. This is where it all comes together: the 3D scans, the videos, the backstory, and all the extensive behind the scenes painful work, and definitely COVID did not help. The most challenging part of the entire process was working through multiple iterations and having to innovate as we go. The whole team believes that the project presents itself as a powerful resource for students, teachers, researchers, architects, historians, and collectors, and sets a great precedent for other such collections. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayher. And next up, we have Ben Waters.
Thanks, Rory. What I might do is just quickly share my screen.
Is your camera off, Ben?
It's not. I've actually got two. So you might be able to see me in another tile. I've got my camera logged in and my microphone logged in on a different, for complicated technical reasons.
That's better. Okay, good. Thank you. Go for it.
Great. So thanks, Rory. And thanks to everyone. In particular, thanks to Open House and the University of Melbourne for having us. A quick little bit of background on us at SI Projects. We work at the intersection of design and digitisation. And we provided the 3D scanning services for this project. I'm also an architect, so this is a really interesting context to be working in. And I think I've found myself in this field because of some of the skills that architects and designers have inherently, in particular 3D modeling, 3D imaging, spatial analysis, these sorts of things that I found had value in other fields, and specifically this sort of emerging field of digital heritage. We began SI Projects actually in 2018 on a collaborative project with the Ian Potter Museum of Art at the University of Melbourne. And we were really using this relationship as a kind of test bed and a process of experimentation with digitising the arts faculty's classics and archaeology collection. And over 2.5 years, we've built up a small digital collection of 3D scan objects. But actually, this collection was the focus of a series of design studios that we led with the School of Design and the architecture and design students there in the School of Design. And the design students were actually working to speculate on the future of museum culture, and in particular how digital collections and maybe processes like virtual reality might impact gallery design and experiences and interactions within museum culture. We also provide sort of broader range of 3D imaging services. In particular, LiDAR scanning is a form of laser 3D scanning, that we've been working on recently to scan heritage environments in particular and remnant landscapes around Victoria. But this form of 3D scanning that we used for this project is called photogrammetry. And this is our humble photogrammetry setup, which consists of a series of lights, cameras, and different sort of automated equipment, which makes it a little easier for us to sort of work through this large amount of scans that we have to do. There's a short sort of time lapse here, which gives you a bit of an understanding of the sort of process of capturing the image data that we need to process the 3D models. And so really just a kind of brief definition or background on photogrammetry. It's the process of using photography to produce accurate and measurable information of an object or an environment. Our project desk was really full of various sort of digital and analog devices that were there to kind of help us measure and calibrate scale in particular, which is a really challenging process in photogrammetry, but also to calibrate color and image color through the capturing process, to ensure that that sort of transition between the physical and the digital is accurate and precise. This is what it begins to look like in our processing software. And this is these multiple image positions. So each one of these squares, these blue squares, represents one photograph. And so for the models that we've been producing, the digital model is made up of a process of 100 to 200 photographs. And the software works through a series of fairly complex processes of pixel comparison and depth analysis to build an accurate bit of 3D geometry. But I think as Rory introduced, the question maybe is more about, you know, what is this digital object and how can we kind of interpret it and what might its sort of value and use cases be? And I suppose one of the sort of technical answers to that question is, can be talked through this idea or this issue of resolution. This is a really key concern for us when we're producing 3D scans. In particular, there's two types of resolution discussions that happen during the process. One is a model resolution. So there are various resolutions that we can process the models to, and they might relate to different use cases in particular, and they have implications in particular for memory and storage. So on the left is a very high resolution, 1 million poly detail of one of the bricks, and you can see that this is made up of 1 million bits of triangulated digital data. And might be really useful for processes of sort of detailed examination or even detailed 3D printing if these forms and objects were to be reproduced. Whereas on the right is a low resolution model where we see a sort of more manageable bit of data in terms of its size in particular, and it might have sort of use value in processes like game development and VR, where memory is quite important. So this is the sort of base model that we see, the kind of form and makeup of one of the 3D objects, just a blank bit of 3D surface geometry. But the other form of resolution that we talk a lot about is texture, and in particular texture maps. And I think for me, this, to a certain extent, the material resolution of the model is the key representation here for this collection. In a kind of, maybe in a contradiction almost, that the digital version of these objects might help to support a closer reading of the material culture of the collection. So what we're looking at here is a sort of unfolding of the surface geometry with an embedded image texture on it, which describes really the material characteristics of the object at a very high resolution. That can be 4 or 8K image resolution. I think these textures and the maps in particular are really interesting representations, and maybe when thought of as a kind of almost digital archaeology, or even just an extension of other forms of surface and material analysis in cultural heritage study, the sort of unfolding and reproduction of surface and material characteristics. Mihir has presented the models in their online format. I was going to do a quick demonstration, but maybe we'll skip through that. We can always revisit the online platform and the interactions that can come from each of those. But I was going to also sort of point towards the kind of broader context of where this technology is at the moment. Photogrammetry in particular as a digitization process has its kind of commercial use within large game development companies, which are very quickly and really efficiently almost working towards digitizing everything on the planet. And these models are used for the construction of virtual environments for game development. I think the question, I suppose, is how do we not lose the sort of stories and the significance that come through these models within this sort of vast, flat, non-hierarchical kind of online digital space, and something that maybe we can talk about as we go on today. I think that just quickly, Rory, I will just summarize last slides, but
go ahead.
But I was going to say, just in terms of this this context of gaming and real-time gaming engines in particular, maybe there is also an opportunity for this collection and other digitized collections to be engaged with and interacted with in new ways, and that maybe play has an interesting sort of role to play with new forms of access, new forms of engagement, and maybe particularly for architecture students in this instance who can use this digital and virtual reality space to explore material and scale comparison, and also sort of forms of assemblage that maybe we haven't been able to previously. Thanks very much.
Super. Thank you, Ben. And then finally, we have Hannah Lewi.
Thanks, Rory. Mayhead, do you want to put up a slide?
I'm just sharing my screen.
Yeah, I can just talk to that. Great. So thanks to Naomi and Ben and Mayhair, who've really been responsible for all the work on this great initiative. And as Rory and Naomi introduced, ACAHUCH as a research centre and supported by the Vera Moore Foundation in this instance, I think we and the faculty are very much playing a very minor supporting host role once the website is complete. But ACAHUCH aims to be an online repository of resources, for example, research papers, student theses, catalogues, communicating events, training opportunities. So as a plug, have a look at our website if you haven't already. And I suppose I'll be very brief, but been involved in a big research project about looking at the history and design of Australian university campuses and thinking about the idea that, I guess, situating this kind of collection in a long history of collections and collecting that this university, along with many others in Australia and of course worldwide, have engaged in. And collecting things, whether art, anthropological things, natural objects, books, or indeed building materials, was often started by either one academic through the course of their research or through philanthropic donations. And a number of these have grown into really important collections that have found a public home in purpose-built archives, libraries, museums, galleries on campus, of which Melbourne University has a number. And these have become really, I think, valuable places for engaging with the public and the community, of sharing knowledge and so on. But there's lots of others that remain in cabinets, shelves, offices that can no longer be accessible. So the digital, I think, as technology affords us, you know, an opportunity to bring these highly sometimes personal and valuable collections into a new format so they can be experienced by many. And that's been pursued in the arts faculty, the new science gallery and more in the university. And I think what's also exciting is how 3D scanning that we see in use here through this, and others have already said it, that there is this basic opportunity to isolate and examine some everyday and ordinary material or technology or building system that's either been forgotten, taken for granted, hidden or lost. And so, you know, there's, I think, potentially really interesting and valuable opportunities for understanding our material history, how buildings were made, by whom, how do we conserve them. And so I think, you know, this might be a bit controversial to say in heritage circles, but there's been a big push within the heritage world in the last 10 years or so to think, and rightly so, about the social and the intangible aspects and values of conservation and heritage practice. But, you know, perhaps somewhere along the way there, we've forgotten about the material and the tangible. So this kind of collection, I think, in a sort of counterintuitive way, because it's digital, but it does return us firmly to looking at stuff and at the material. And I think that's the hope anyway. And just in passing then, to look at a couple of examples in the collection. Can you go to the next one, Mayher, the nails? And I'll come back to the brick in a sec. Yeah, great. So this is a collection of Eubank nails, and really has been understood in detail only through recent research and fieldwork. I'm taking this information directly from the collection. It's not my research, but it's a British nail that found its main market outside of Britain and most of all in Australia, where the hardwoods, as you can imagine, presented a huge problem. So even American nails, which were seen to be generally better than British ones, couldn't be driven into Australian timber without breaking. So the Eubank pressed nail resolved this problem and was much used in Australia and in various sizes and profiles, and was the subject of a lot of British patents. So this tells us potentially a lot, not only about how buildings were put together, about manufacturing, about trade in the British Empire and more. And nails sort of be thought of, I think, as this old-fashioned glue of buildings. I was reading an article the other day about how we glue our buildings together now. So the idea that this is almost becoming a rarity of contemporary construction. Instead, you know, it's the glue that is now the adhesives and the precast panels and the veneers and so on. And briefly going back to the brick, we've seen already quite a few bricks, but this is another item in the collection, and most handmade convict bricks had their own stamping system. You can see here it's a heart. There were hearts, diamonds, clubs, like playing cards. And again, this is not my research, this is learnt from the collection, that they are found rarely in Victoria but are common in New South Wales and Tasmania. And so again, it allows us to think more about brick making, about the importance of bricks in Melbourne architecture particularly, and Victorian architecture. And without any coordination, Rory stole my quote from Lou Kahn about the importance of the brick.
Sorry.
That's fine. But it obviously shows how whenever we say brick as architects, we think of the American 20th century architect Lou Kahn, who famously talked to his bricks and asked them what they want to be. But he believed, I think, that materials had a sort of stubborn sense of their own destiny. And, you know, I think, as others have said, that along with the 3D scans, the videos, the interpretive texts and so on that will be an important part of this collection, hopefully they do give some sort of presence and voice to these material things. They make them articulate. So that's really the aim of I think, ACAHUCH and the faculty, to foster interest in these kinds of collections so that the public can use, students can use, and practitioners. And I think that I'll leave it there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Hannah. And sorry again for stealing the Louis Kahn quote, but it's just such a good one. How can we not, when we're talking about digital bricks? Now, we will have a discussion, I suppose. I'm looking around for Seb in the windows. Here he is. Seb, I can either ask you a question or you can jump in. What would you rather do?
I don't know. I think it's an amazing project. I'm kind of interested in this notion of what opportunities digital opens up. I mean, I think through my team's work here at the Smithsonian and Powerhouse prior to that, you know, there's always been this thought that digital versions open up opportunities, new opportunities, the sort of this popularization of the digital twin, and it feels like we're still trying to figure out how this works. It works in a database sense, and how this works at scale. Because I think, as we heard a bit earlier on, that, you know, there's these now, but these objects are digitized. They now exist in a larger realm of assets. But I question what is lost when things become in that way flattened, and how the specificity of that is lost. And I'm kind of curious to sort of poke at what are the affordances of the digital brick that the physical brick doesn't have. What is now made possible, and that question again of resolution. We talked a lot about the resolution of scanning, but it feels like the resolution that we don't have a good method or approach to still is the resolution of metadata. That metadata is by necessity reductive, and really in service of discovery and basically search. But how do we get beyond that? So those are sort of some provocations that I would put out there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Seb. And it's a similar question. Well, your first question is very similar to one which Ian Scott has posted in the chat, where he's asking, how do we address aspects of objects like tactility and weight, and what is lost when these things become assets, as you say, and get repurposed for video games? So would any of the project team like to grab hold of that one? What is lost in the tactility?
Well,
Naomi.
when I saw that question come through, I was like, oh dear, because we had a discussion really with Miles about, do we record the weight? Like, and at the time, you know, we went around circles discussing pros and cons, and we decided not to. And I'm not sure if that's the right thing to do or not in the long term. So we haven't recorded the weight.
But even the recording of the weight, I mean, I'm struck by the comparison between the students that you described picking up those objects on the table and what the experience is of turning it around in the screen. Yeah, or Naomi?
We haven't tested it, so I don't know. I think,
of course, I would assume you learn some new things and some other things are obscured. Because the project hasn't really been launched, it hasn't been used in teaching yet. We're looking for those first couple of subjects to really try out how it's going to work and what it's going to do. But I guess Ben might have some experience having taught in the design studios with the other collections. Yeah, Ben.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think from our perspective, we sort of understand these as models and not necessarily as sort of replacement for the physical interaction. And knowing, I think, that there's a lot of advantages that come with the technology and to try to take advantage of the technology, but also to understand that it's sort of more of a tool of supporting preservation rather than being a sort of substitute for preservation. But certainly, I think as well that maybe architects have a sort of emerging opportunity to be designers of experience as well as just designers of sort of physical space. And that's something that we've looked at in the design studios that I've been running at the School of Design, in particular how the virtual world might overlap and superimpose itself on the real world, and how maybe these models can be sort of used in processes of design and interaction and those sorts of things through these new interfaces. I don't think that I have the answer of exactly what this will sort of become into the future, but I do think that there's an opportunity, at least with this collection, as Hannah was saying, to sort of support an understanding of the material culture of the collection in particular. That's something that, of course, you can do physically when engaging with the materials, which I think is, you know, always probably the primary form of interaction with cultural heritage. But it can be augmented or supported by other forms of interactions. And in this case, I think the material comparisons, the detail in particular of the material characteristics, being able to sort of quickly drag and drop these models into digital platforms to place them next to each other and even test and potentially simulate the way in which materials can be composed and related to one another in space, I think is, you know, a potential opportunity for design, and in particular design education. And we always use models in architecture in offices or at the school as a way of simulating construction or simulating spatial relationships. And I think that this is probably just a sort of extension of the existing tools that we have at our disposal to do those kinds of exercises in testing, modeling, and simulation.
No, absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you, Ben. I'm interested then to, well, address some of these other questions that we've got in the chat. We've got a busy chat going on here. So we've got some technical questions around the status of the collection, the accuracy and the collection management system used. Perhaps we could address those very quickly so people are aware, or perhaps direct them to somewhere where they can find out. I'd rather not have a very technical discussion today. I think there's some bigger cultural questions that we can also tackle. So yes, perhaps Naomi or Meher could address the technical.
I saw a question which was asking, does the collection have a Victorian focus on building materials from across Australia? We've got building materials from across Australia, but because it was collected by Professor Miles Lewis, it does limited to where he was going for his sites and where his students were visiting, or the people that he knew who gave it to them, where they collected it from. So we do have a bit more focus on the Victorian, the Victorian architecture of that era, but we've also got things from other places. We've got a trenail from 1700s, which we found here, which was, I think, found here, but was from somewhere else. So we've got very varying things in the collection.
Super, thank you, Mayher. Now, we also have Miles in the room.
We do have Miles.
I'm not sure if Miles is prepared to speak, but we'd love to hear from you, Miles, if you're aware.
Yes, of course, I'm happy to speak. This is all rather stunning. This was a very serendipitous collection, not designed to be a complete display or systematic collection at all. And I'm surprised how much has been drawn out of it and impressed. But I would remind everyone that there's no substitute for holding the actual object in your hand. And even beyond that, for being on the site in front of the object. If I can take a student to a site and say, what's that bit of metal hanging off the corner of the roof? It's much better than showing them the piece of metal in a studio or something. It's really a question of drawing the viewer in to interact with the material rather than just presenting, however well it is, the object. So this to me is a wonderful sort of resource, but it's a substitute for the real thing.
Yeah, absolutely, fantastic. Well, and what do you think of the work that they've done then?
Well, it's technically fantastic, and it seems sometimes to be too much of resources to do rather humble objects. But and I don't know that turning a brick around upside down tells you much more than having 3 photographs of it. But it is a way of engaging people, engaging the viewer to feel it's interesting, and to that extent, it's wonderful. Fantastic.
Well, it's great to have you here, and it's great to be able to work with your fantastic collection. Now, excuse me while I scan some more questions in the chat. And if anybody has a particular question for the panelists, or indeed for Miles, I'm sure he's happy to answer it. You could also raise your hand and ask it viva voce. But I think this question of what is it replacing? I mean, I imagine there's a slippery slope as well, where if you've got the digital scan, then it can potentially be used as a justification to lose the physical thing, and that would seem to be the undoing of much of this digital preservation.
I think to answer that one, Rory, I think most collection managers realised that there was lots of mistakes made in the 1990s when they thought if they digitised something that the original object could just be thrown out. Right. And technology changed since then, so the files that they have scanned it at are no longer usable, so the digital files have been lost, and if the physical has gotten rid of, then the physical's been lost too.
No, absolutely. And I guess I'm thinking less about objects which are in collections, but for instance, whole buildings or spaces. I have heard this mentioned now and then that, oh, well, we've got a 3D scan. So it's not an accusation of this project, but perhaps just a repeating of mistakes made before. Now, we do have a couple more minutes left, so if there are any, I'm trying to scan the chat, but I'm really terrible at doing that and multitasking. We've got lots of questions about this question of the weight and the metadata. So I think you'll have to go back and measure all the things. Unfortunately. So here we are, Felicity, thank you. Interesting to hear Miles speak of the lived experience of the objects in situations. Do you think it will be beneficial for students to draw the objects in real life as a record? Miles?
Well, I can see the merit in that, but it's not nearly as important as drawing actual complete buildings, because when architects and students used to draw complete buildings in 3 dimensions, they learned an awful lot about them, which I don't believe you do today by computer drafting. You understood how things went together. You really had a picture of the volume, and that I think is lost, and there's probably no way of retrieving it anymore. It's just gone. And
this is presumably a symptom of students wandering around with cameras in their hands. So a long problem, but it's a question of looking, isn't it?
A question of being made to look, yes.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, just to chip in there, I think that's, you know, that's been a perennial thing we've been talking about in architecture education since computers came along, about how do we retrain drawing, how do we retain actually going out and looking at something on site. And you know, without sort of, I suppose, being obvious with COVID, it's really accentuated that, and we feel the loss of that, that the digital has helped quite a lot in the way we educate, but doesn't substitute for those key attributes.
Thank you, Hannah. I might go back to Seb to perhaps zoom out one layer and to discuss really the future of the museum. You know, we're in the middle of this shift from, not from physical to digital, but we're embracing these multiple parallel modes at once. And particularly with a place like ACME, where you've got lots of digital media which are born digital. Yeah. What is the future of the museum? What is the future of the collection?
Yeah, look, I think it's interesting because, you know, we deal with mostly, I mean, even contemporary commissions and contemporary collections are born digital now, or even the plans for mounting a physical work are also digital too. So it's an interesting one, and I think it comes down to exploring the affordances of both the physical and the different affordances of the digital. And I'd come back to that sort of sense of, how do people draw? How do people take photos? Well, the technologies of looking and technologies of drawing with different benefits. And I would suggest that the future museum is one that merges those two and perhaps pushes on the specificity of the physical and draws attention explicitly to that specificity when you're there in person, but then pushes out to the comparative opportunities of the database view when you leave, or when you look across all of the bricks. How kind of does this specific brick that I'm looking at compare to a million other bricks? That's only possible with a digital version of the brick. The physical brick, though, we should be, I would suggest, drawing out the human stories around that brick and the nuance. And I think that comes back to my earlier question, I guess, about the resolution of metadata. We don't have, you know, the weight, for example. Well, what are the other qualities of that brick? If we looked specifically at the kind of physical brick, how do we document those, whilst also pointing out to the broader comparative view that a database allows? But we don't have the physical spaces that allow this to happen effectively yet. And I think we're still working through what that looks and, importantly, feels like. You know, I think the other piece is, what are those characteristics that aren't easily scanned or quantified? The feeling of a room is not something that a LiDAR scan captures, for example, or let alone the lived experience.
No, fantastic. Thank you, Seb. And unless we have any pressing questions, I wanted to come back to your point, Hannah, which I thought was really fascinating, about the kind of changing way of architectural research, really the changing mode from one which has perhaps been focused on, let's say, the canonical histories of names and buildings and places, and to one which is now driven by other questions of material or of construction, and I mean, I imagine these types of stories, these types of histories are much more, well, they're less exceptional, aren't they? You use the word ordinary, you know, but that they run through and define the way cities are built in these, you know, decades or over centuries. So perhaps you could reflect on how that's changing the way that you're working with this kind of material.
Yeah, look, I think there is a bit of a return to material history. I think in the face of kind of a more theoretical few decades. But for instance, our annual symposium for ACAHUCH this year is looking at sort of empire and how trade and exchange through, I guess, a sort of imperial networks focus on making material stuff and circulating it, and so how buildings are made and the practices around that. And that's reflecting what's going on, I think, at the moment in history as well, as a very welcome return to the physical and the material. And yeah, we'll post more information about that symposium soon. But and it's certainly something, say, within the Masters of Urban and Cultural Heritage, there are subjects about drawing buildings, about doing site visits, about understanding how things are made and put together as we become increasingly divorced from. And there's been so many comments about that in the chat that we're sort of been pushed into a highly visual world rather than a tactile one. So that's sort of front and centre about, I think, education and research's mind.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Hannah. We have a question from Miles. Please go ahead.
You're trying to finish up. I was just going to say
yes,
that for me, this is not so much part of the context of objects and museums, it's part of the context of digitising for research purposes. So I place this in the context of another project Mayor has been doing, which is to scan trade literature of mine, which has now gone onto the web into the Building Heritage Technology Library in the United States. So a huge mass of ordinary trade literature is now available for students to use. And the third aspect is what I've just published on this year, architectural drawings, which no longer are understood. That is, no longer can modern architects, still less can modern curators understand old drawings. So to cover those fields has been important to me, not just the materials.
No, absolutely fantastic. Well, I am going to wrap up. So please, first of all, thanks to Open House for hosting us. Thank you to ACAHUCH, and the link has gone into the chat for those who want to find out more about the collection, more about ACAHUCH's research, more about the papers that they're publishing and so on. A special thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to Naomi, to Meher, to Ben, Hannah, and to Seb, and especially thank you to Miles for joining the discussion and for the incredible work over decades assembling this material so that we can all try and make sense of it. And thanks especially to everyone for coming. It's fantastic to have such a great turnout and on such a interesting and technical subject. So thanks all for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rory. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Eb. Sorry. Cheers.